Hello, everyone who's joined us. Thank you very much, and welcome to this session on socially responsible architecture. We're very happy today to have Kareem Ibrahim, who's going to talk to us about sustainable tourism in the context of Esna, a city in the south of Egypt, and the idea of social responsibility with such a project. But before that, just going to talk about very briefly about two other architects who I think embody also, like Kareem, embody the ideas of social responsibility in their work. So over the past 6 sessions, we've looked at different aspects of architecture as pertaining to the Muslim world and identity, the environment. And one of the things, obviously, is how do architects see their role and what role is given to architects. And I thought I'd start with a quote by Yasmin Lari, who is the first female Pakistani architect. She was born in 1941, educated in the UK at Oxford. And she started off building very lavish and expensive and huge monumental buildings, often for government institutions. And as her career progressed, she decided that actually, while these buildings had merit and she was proud to have built them, she was much more interested in thinking about how do the less privileged members of society live and interact with space and with buildings, and how can we ensure that good design also applies to them and is relevant to them and is dedicated to them. And so she devoted, currently most of her work is low cost, local materials, buildings that are catering to the poorest people in Pakistani society. But in her own words, she says, I was a star architect for 36 years, that then my egoistical journey came to an end, and it's not just the elite who have the right to good design. That isn't to say that you can't have social responsibility in buildings for the elite. Of course you can, but I thought Yasmin was an interesting person to reflect on the idea of someone evolving their career in a way where the focus shifts from, this is the Pakistani oil building, which is a government building that deals with all of the aspects pertaining to the oil industry. It was built in 1991 by Yasmin Lari, and is an example of her early work. But her later work is very different. And the second person I want to mention is Marina Tabassum, who's younger. She's born in 1968. She's won multiple awards in the past few years. She's based in Bangladesh. And one of the things that I find interesting about Marina's work is that whether she's designing an embassy or a hut for the poorest people in Bangladesh, for her and throughout her entire career, the social role of the architect of bettering society and thinking about how can design actually produce a better society and produce better spaces for people has been at the heart of her practice. And talking to Marina is really interesting because everything she does, she thinks about this idea of what is my responsibility as an architect, as a practitioner who can create a better environment. So for example, she's not interested in working on projects outside Bangladesh because she feels that she knows the context of Bangladesh very well. That's really her subject. That's where she can contribute most significantly. And so that's what she focuses on. She minimizes travel, not just because of the environment, but because she feels that while travel is very good and fruitful in many ways, it's disruptive of her practice. And so she considers very thoughtfully whether going to a conference, say, what are the pros and cons of taking a week off from work? And she sees, obviously, her mission is to improve living conditions in Bangladesh, her home country, through her design. And she rightly points out that the construction industry contributes very significantly to carbon emissions. And she thinks, well, how can I address that? And I'm going to actually show you a couple of projects of Marina Tabassum. The last one deals with people who have a zero carbon footprint. But this is a design for the Franco-German embassy in Dhaka in Bangladesh. So a joint French-German embassy. And the reason I chose it is because I started off with Yasmin Lari's building, the state oil company. I wanted to show you that you can design, and many architects do design buildings for the most comfortable and prominent echelons of society, and you can still embed all of the commitment to social responsibility. That it doesn't mean that because you're interested in social responsibility, you're only designing for the poor or for those of limited incomes. In this case, I mean, what Marina's design for this building embodies is thinking about about the environment, about ventilation, using traditional techniques with a very modern building that actually serves, in some ways, a very modern purpose. And this is a project from 2009, thinking about light, air, ventilation, and yet it isn't a building for the poor of Bangladesh. It's for a very different function. She's very famous actually for the Beitur Rauf Mosque, which was built in 2012, so 10 years ago, for which she won the Aga Khan Award. The building is contemporary in its expression, but uses locally available bricks, and it also uses local traditional means of using those bricks in architecture. And as you will have known through our 6 sessions, one of the challenges in the global south is often to respect local tradition and respect local and locally available building materials. And in Marina Tabassum's mosque, it's a really magnificent building. I think Kareem's actually visited it. And it shows you how you can be contemporary, traditional, and with the most basic and low cost of materials, produce inspiring, moving architecture. This building cost $150,000. So not much given its size, given its community value, and it's a building of which the local community has become very proud. And one of its greatest aspects is the way in which it works with light. And you can see the effect of a pierced roof, but also the mihrab, and I mean the direction of Mecca being indicated through light, and many beautiful details using very simple materials and actually simple construction techniques. And this, I mean, obviously, one thing that all good architects think about is how do people actually need to use space, where are the spaces for interaction, for gathering, for pausing, for conversations. In this case, you can see this colonnade where people are having informal chats, but you also see the ablution area, one of the key functions of any mosque. But it's actually rare to find the contemporary mosque that is so contemporary in expression and yet so rooted in local tradition, and so aesthetically pleasing and uplifting. And Marina Tabassum successfully managed to design one. And this is the plan of the mosque, for those of you interested in plans, showing the orientation of the inside of the building facing Mecca, and the external orientation, which is aligned with the street and the urban fabric. And that's why it's like 2 twisted squares. But the project I'm going to conclude this very brief introduction to today's session on is a project that Marina has been working on recently, which is to provide portable, very low cost housing for people with no land in Bangladesh. And these people, actually, they often move around. And one of the areas where they live is mud flat, the equivalent of mud flats. They're called chars that appear after the monsoon rains. You find slivers of land appearing on the banks of rivers. These bits of land are not always there. I mean, they come and go, but people without land use them as a place to build a home. And Marina has designed very low. I mean, they cost 300 sterling pounds, so really very little. Made of traditional materials, very much in keeping with local tradition, but using structural solutions that make them robust to rain and storms. You can move them easily. They're flat packable, so you can move around as these chars appear and disappear. And they also accommodate the fact that, I mean, Bangladesh is a country prone to floods. And so there are two-level structures on stilts that enable you, if there's a flash flood and you have to kind of go higher up, you can do so. And in Marina's own words, she says that these chars, the land I'm trying to describe, it isn't really land, it's wetness, it belongs to the river, but it serves the landless people, at least, it gives them some form of relief where they can fish, cultivate, and settle with their families. So it's a good example. I think Marina's career is an excellent example of someone whose ethics and whose outlook cater to all echelons of her society, addressing the same issues, but to very different people and obviously with very different budgets. And this is showing you what these houses look like. As you can see, they're elevated. They're made mainly of bamboo, but they also have corrugated iron. So they don't shun modern building materials, but they're based very strongly on tradition. And like I'm sure many of you have been to IKEA, they have the same element of how can a house be portable and you can fold it up and move it with minimal labor, because obviously labor is a cost. And so if you minimize labor, you're also minimizing the cost. And here is an example showing you the context of these areas of so-called land that appear, are cultivable, and also are basically on the edge of the river. So there's often the river is a source of food and livelihood. And you can see in this case also the latrine, the outhouse. It's a very, very simple structure, but it serves a purpose. And I think, as Yasmin Lari actually said, it isn't only the wealthy and the affluent who have the right to good design. Often good design is best showcased and best applied when you really have to think, how do we serve people who have little and are often overlooked? And with that, it's a very appropriate time to introduce Kareem Ibrahim, my former colleague and longtime friend, who's an architect who's worked in very many different contexts in Egypt, and who has invested a lot of time understanding the tourism industry in Egypt, which is obviously a big driver of the economy, but also thinking critically about how can it serve people more effectively. He's worked extensively in urban conservation, always in a community-led and a participatory process. So Kareem is going to tell us about Isna, a town or city in the south of Egypt that not that many people may know of, but it's very significant historically. So please, Kareem, we welcome you and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Saif. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Sure. First, I'm so flattered you're putting me in the same presentation with Marina Tabassum and Yasmin Lari. So definitely they are like great architects. One looks forward to become like at least follow their model and role examples as like very fine architects who serve their communities. That said, what I'd like to share with you today is a project that has been in the process for almost like 8 years now. It began around 2015, 2016, with earlier, let's say, commitment since 2010. And it basically builds on a lot of what we have learned at Takween, the firm that I co-founded and been working in it since 14 years now, is like 3 other co-founders. And so far we have implemented more than like 100 projects. This is one of them. But in a way, this manages to bring together many of the lessons learned that we have been through together for the past 2 decades, especially the work we have done with the Aga Khan Trust for Culture in historic Cairo, where we work together safe over there. So let me give a quick introduction about Isna. Isna is a city located in Upper Egypt, almost 60 kilometers to the south of Luxor, the famous destination in Luxor, in Upper Egypt. And it's a historic city that has been around since the ancient Egyptian times. So we're talking about a span of like occupation for more than 3,000 to 4,000 years of continuous occupation of the same site. And basically, what we find right now in Isna, and usually I start with this image because it shows the complexity of the urban fabric of Isna. In the back, you see the Temple of Khnum, which was built almost like 180 BC. So this is almost like more than 2,000 years old. And the front of the image, you can see a minaret, which is built by the Fatimids. It means it's almost like 1,000 years old. And around, you can see like builds of the churches or like towers of the churches that have been built on other historic sites that have been there in the city, and a plethora of historic buildings and significant buildings that were built by rich families that used to inhabit the city, especially from the end of the 19th century and the 20th century as well. So basically, it's a place where you can find multiple layers of the Egyptian history, like all together in one place, in less than 80 acres of an area, which is a situation that's very rare in the Egyptian context. So when we say Isna is a historic city, it comes as, let's say, as a logical finding, but in fact, it's not. And this is the thing that I've been working on for the past 8 years to like proof of concept that this is a historic city, because unfortunately, there is no common agreement between many different parties that this was a historic city. When we came to Isna in 2010, we were commissioned by the government to develop an upgrading plan for the city, especially the area surrounding what is known to be like the Temple of Khnum, which is a Greco-Roman temple located in the middle of the city. What we found when we started, and this was my first time to go there because many people ask me if like I was born there because I know the city so much, but that's not the case. I just like got introduced to it in 2010. So when we went around asking like government officials, tourism industry, and like local residents, they were all talking about the temple as the main attraction of the city, and that's it. They were mentioning nothing else but this temple. They were just ignoring anything else that existed there. And to us, when we start delving into like the tourism industry in Upper Egypt, we found this is like a very common situation in many other like Egyptian cities in Upper Egypt. So basically, what you see to the left is a map you can find in a bookshop or like a tourist store or whatever, where it shows you the sites in Upper Egypt that you can visit. And if you can see, they are all either temples or tombs or statues or whatever that all belong to the ancient Egyptian, if not like the Greco-Roman era, that's almost like 2,000 years old and more. And this works a little, like brings a lot of tourists to Upper Egypt, not that much that we aspire to, and we're going to see this like in a couple of slides, but it works. The tourism industry as the cultural, let's say, dimension of cultural tourism is working, and in fact, it attracts some tourists. But when you ask Egyptians what are the known historic cities in Upper Egypt, this is a difficult question to answer. Basically, not because of lack of like such cities, it's the lack of recognition of like these settlements as historic cities. We're not accustomed to that in Egypt. We think of historic Cairo as a historic city, a city like Rosetta as a historic city, but never cities in Upper Egypt. And basically, because of the overwhelming impact of the existing sites and what's surrounding them as urban fabric. Hence, there are no conservation plans or promotion plans for such historic cities because we don't recognize them as cities in the first place. If we take the Isna case, which was like repetitive in many other cities in Upper Egypt, we can see like this is a photo of the city in the early 1900s. And by many, like let's say indicators and measures, this is a historic city. It's an accumulation over time of historic structures, activities, habits, like social networks that have been concentrated in one location for more than 3,000 or 4,000 years, juxtaposed next to each other. You can see like the temple in the middle of the picture, In front of it, a 1,000 years old mosque. To the right of the temple, a 300 years old caravanserai, and a full like city on fabric built of mud bricks over like centuries that accumulated together. So definitely this is a historic city by any kind of definition, and has this kind of diverse and multi-layered cultural heritage that is unfortunately was not recognized by the time we arrived to the city. So we went there, like we started looking around the temple, and we found that the city enjoys a lot actually of potentials, even in terms of like merely what we call tangible heritage, not to mention the intangible heritage of the city itself. So we have the temple, we have a very rich Coptic history in the city, we have handicrafts, we have Islamic monuments such as the Ambriya minaret, and we have more than 100 significant buildings that were built by prominent families all around the city. Not to mention the fabulous architecture that we found over there. So basically these are like normal buildings. When you go around, you can see them. Unfortunately, the building to the left, it was knocked down between 2010 and today. It doesn't exist anymore. Many of these buildings are endangered of like disappearing, and there are no protection plans for them, unfortunately, in place. Another dimension that people like really value is the lifestyle, of what we call like the intangible dimension of culture, that when you walk around the city and you see how people are dressed, how they behave, how they sit around the corner, this is like a completely different culture than even from other parts of Egypt where you can travel and see around. So we started thinking of like, what are the trends to promote cultural tourism, how we can actually build on the potential of the city. So we needed to understand, firstly, like the situation in ESNA, and also what are the global trends in this like realm. ESNA was, since its like inception, was a city known for two main activities: trade and agriculture. So it's located on the route of like very important trade routes since like the ancient Egyptian times, connecting Egypt to Africa, and also connecting Egypt between the 13th and the 18th century through a connection of like what is called the Indian Ocean Economic System, which is an economic system that spanned from India to Morocco, and Egypt was in the middle or at the heart of the system. So basically, it was a city known for trade. In the 1970s, when tourism started to boom in Egypt, there were like this product of like this Nile cruises between Luxor and Aswan, located to the south. And this now is located in the middle. And because in 1906, there was a barrage, an old barrage that was built in the city, the Nile cruises had to stay for almost 8 to 12 hours to cross this barrage on the way between Luxor and Aswan. So tourists had no other option but going down and actually visiting the city, and it was thriving as a business in the 1970s and the 1980s. And this was a main source of income for the city. In 1995, the Egyptian and Italian governments, they built a new barrage that allowed the ships to cross like ESNA very quickly, maybe in 20 minutes or 30 minutes. So ESNA became like an optional visit on the route between Luxor and Aswan, resulting in so rapid decline in the number of tourists, hence the economy of the city. And this was the case in 2010. Most of the shops were closed. They are not used because like tourists were not coming anymore. When we started our project in 2016 and early 2017, our focus was to rapidly increase the number of tourists. And we're going to see like how this happened, but let me tell you some figures of what we've been able to achieve. Between 2017 and 2019, we achieved the highest increase in number of visitation in any cultural heritage sites all over Egypt. We increased the number of tourists by 305%. So it's basically, we tripled the number of tourists like visiting the city in only 2 years. And this was the highest rate, as I said, all over Egypt, in the region and also in Cairo and everywhere else. And this was due to mostly to the efforts of the project. And this was a major success. But the story is not that bright, because basically we managed to increase the number of visitors from 20,000 to 60,000. So this is still a very meager figure in the regional, let's say, tourism movement within the city itself and its surroundings. So if we look at this map, which shows like the green are the sites that are located in Luxor to the north of ESNA, then you have ESNA in red, then you have Edfu and Komombo, two other major sites to the south in blue, and then in yellow you have Aswan and its sites. This is still some interesting figures, because this was measured from the figures of the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities immediately before COVID. So this was like a high year in tourism in Egypt, where Egypt received 13 million visitors on 2019. That's just before COVID happened. And this was one of the highest years in a decade of time. If we look at this figure, if we have received 13 million visitors, that means only 1.2 million visited Luxor. And we have similar figures visiting cultural heritage sites in Cairo. That means that only 9% of tourism coming to Egypt went to cultural heritage sites. 91% was on the shore. In fact, on like visiting the sea or the beach or whatever, despite the very rich and diverse content that Egypt has in terms of cultural sites and offerings. And if we look at this 1.2 figure, half of them went south on night cruises to Aswan, okay? Because in Komombo, we have visitation of almost like 600,000 visitors. However, the ones who only went from the boat to visit Isna are only 60,000. That means like a very little number of visitors. Despite the fact it shows that this is a very little number, but at least it gives us some hope if we can easily increase the number of visitations without needing to change the routes of like tourism in Egypt, which is so difficult to change these routes. It's basically would like to capture what is like happening around us and benefit from it. Another thing we did to understand the type of customers that we're dealing with, the visitors and so on, was to ask them, because this is something that doesn't happen actually in the tourism industry pretty much. There is no feedback loop in the Egyptian context where we can ask tourists what did they like about a site or a place or whatever, what type of services they are lacking. But we did so. We wanted to have, not to look from the point of view of decision makers or like the tourism industry, we just needed to hear from the guests that are coming to the city. What they aspire to have and what they'd like to see in the city happening. And the results were like actually supporting our arguments, is that the main attraction of Isna is not the temple, it's the city itself as a historic city, and that contains a temple in it. And this shifts a lot our way and our approach towards urban conservation and the type of services that we'd like to present. Another thing we did, we started to understand the global, let's say, trends about cultural tourism. And here there is a very interesting thing that we found, is that what we like define in Egypt as cultural tourism is not cultural tourism. It's, let's say, antiquities related visits or antiquities sites tourism or whatever. It's not cultural tourism, because at the end, cultural tourism, when we looked at like different sources, these are like the 7 main drivers of cultural tourism trends in the future. Sustainable development, sites with sustainable development activities, cuisine and food, which is #1 actually motivation for movement of cultural tourism, solo travel, new ways of transport, local experience with people and like food and everything, traveling off the beaten path, and personalization. Nothing of them mentions sites or like things to see or museums or whatever. It's more interacting with the culture of people, which is not happening actually in the case of only focusing on antiquity sites. And this is something that was reassuring to us that we're on the right path. So what we wanted to do was not to like upgrade the city of Isna or promote it, rather to develop a systematic approach actually where we can intervene in such sites. And it relies on like 3 major steps. One is to understand the context. We spent quite good time between 2010 and 2018 trying to understand the city, and we're still trying to understand it and know more about it, about its attractions, the motivations around it, and the tourism industry around it. Second is to build trust with the local stakeholders. So we wanted to like use architecture and interventions as means to build bridges with people. And I'll show how we did that. So people can trust us and we can work together. And we'll talk about people, we'll talk also about the government as well. We wanted to show them that we're serious about this project. And third is to focus on what we call the visitor experience, which is actually the main core of cultural tourism. Visitor experience is something that is relying on 4 main aspects. One is the physical conditions of the site, what we call the state of conservation of a site and its surroundings and everything around it. Second is what we call perception of value. So basically, and we'll come back to the word value later on, there should be like some kind of like significant value about the site that you're dealing with. Third is the interpretation and information provided around the site. And fourth is this quality of the services and the availability of services and reception that you receive when you go to the site. And these were like the 4 pillars that we wanted to develop through our project to ensure that we achieve this quality experience. To do that, we were following some strategies. First, private sector engagement and partnerships. So unlike what we have done in Darb al-Ahmar, whereas like the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, we're more focusing on engaging the private sector, not only the public sector, in doing that. Second, that we mix between promotion and feedback. So we're not only promoting the city, what we care more about is the feedback we receive from the visitors. So we organize visits, we receive people, but what we care about is not to promote the city itself, rather to receive feedback on what can be improved and what can be enhanced from the point of view of the visitors and the users of our sites. Third is economic empowerment and increased revenue capture. And this is so important because we need to develop methods and means that enable the local community to benefit from the increased revenue capture and economic opportunities that are there in the city. To mention one example here, there was like an earlier study, and I cannot remember the source, but it was saying that of each $100 spent on tourism in Egypt, 86 of them stay outside of the country. What goes into the country is only 14, and this $14 are not even divided equally. So what trickles down to the community is very minimal. And this is something we're trying to change right now, and I'll show you how we have been doing that. Fourth, it's community engagement. So basically, we have a very strong arm, like engaging local community with us from different age groups, from different backgrounds and so on. And finally, institutionalization. What we're trying to do is that this approach should be adopted by the state in a way that can be promoted and appears in official decrees that can we can build on and we can use to further develop the city and also other sites as well. So these are different strategies that we have been using. So now that said, let's go into the project a little bit. So the project consists of 2 phases. The first phase ended in 2020, and the new one started in 2021 and will end in 2024. And it basically focuses on developing 3 aspects. One is preserving the city's diverse cultural heritage assets. So we're talking here about intangible heritage and tangible heritage as well. So we're focusing on buildings and site, but also we're focusing on other cultural issues like gastronomy, dresses that people use, arts and culture aspects. So far we have collected more than 31 themes of intangible heritage assets in the city and its surroundings. Second is to develop high-yield tourism products that can actually increase the revenue capture within the community. And third, to promote the city as a unique and prime tourist destination. To do so, let me take you through a group of interventions that actually can show you a demonstration of what has been said, what we've been doing about sites, about intangible heritage, about promotion and so on, and how we can deal with that in a more of a consolidated approach towards cultural tourism in Egypt. So basically, we focused on many sites located in the city itself that were neglected. One of them is the Caravanserai of Al-Giddawi or Wakalat Al-Giddawi. And to who doesn't know a Caravanserai, it's a place which played a very major role in trade in terms of trade routes and caravans. This is where the merchants were coming to a city and display their goods and stay overnight. So it works like a hotel and a place to sell their goods. And without them, trade on caravans would have been impossible. So Isna has one that was built in 1792. So it's almost like an 18th century building. However, this building was never open to the public. It was listed in 1950 as a listed monument in Egypt, but it was closed because it really suffered from structural deterioration and it was never open before we came to the city. So one of the key things we've done is to restore this building. But when we wanted to restore it, we didn't restore it only by using let's say local materials and stuff like that, but also we're using local labor and know-how. So what we did is that we worked with local restorers, local labor. We trained them, all of them, more than 250 people on techniques of restoration and conservation. And these were the ones who implemented the upgrading and conservation of many of the sites that you're going to see. So what we managed to do is to restore this building and actually bring it back to the community again and to the tourism industry. And these are some examples of before and after intervention in the building itself. And basically, it became an attraction in itself, like to the city. So it added an extra dimension to the temple. So now it's not only the temple, you can visit also the caravanserai and many other sites. But more importantly, it became a point of attraction for local visits. So basically, school trips, people from the community coming to visit the city, they were just all coming to the Wakala to understand the role of like ESNA and the national and international trade as well. And to manage this site, because we're not only stopping by restoring the site, we're also focusing on what is called site management, is how to manage the site after it's restored to ensure that it's sustainable beyond the lifetime of the project. And to do that, we did not develop a site management plan. This is the classical approach. What we did is that we took more than 30 local antiquities inspectors over a period of 1 year. So we build the capacity on principles of site management and adaptive reuse. And we actually mentored them to develop their own site management plan. So they were the ones who actually locally developed their plan. And this plan was ratified a couple of months ago by the ministry. And now it's the official plan to manage the site. And basically, it uses the mix between intangible heritage activities, such as Tahtib, for example, which is a UNESCO-listed intangible heritage asset in Egypt, and to give performances at the Wakala at the night time, use the space in the Wakala to have like displays and exhibitions about the city attractions, and use the Wakala in diverse activities that would guarantee the long-term sustainability of the building itself. So this was somehow, because this was a listed building, was the common approach in many other buildings in Egypt, plus like the dimension of using local labor, plus the dimension of site management. But we wanted to do more. We wanted to go outside of the limited boundaries of listed monuments. We wanted to go to the community side itself. And to do so, we started identifying areas or locations of like importance to the community. One of them is called the Qaysariya market. And the Qaysariyas are a typical type of covered markets, street markets in Egypt. You can find many of them in historic Cairo and also in Upper Egypt. And basically, it's a street market covered by a wooden structure, and it holds what's located on the main spine of the city. So in ESNA, we identified the last remaining part of like this traditional structure, almost like 130 meters long, was more than 120 shops all around it. And it was in a very deteriorated condition. So the wooden structure was falling apart. There were electrical cables like resulting in fires. There were encroachments in the street, no paving, no lighting. So we needed to intervene into this market to show people that upgrading is not only about listed monuments, it's also about places that matter to them. So we upgraded this market. Basically, we worked with the local community over there. They contributed financial contributions. The government contributed financial contributions. And our project also contributed funding to that. And we worked all together to upgrade this market. And as a result, it's becoming now like a hotspot in ESNA. So people are like, again, opening shops. Businesses are remaining in the area right now after they were like deciding to leave. So it's basically bringing in economic growth within the area we're working in. And it's one of our very successful interventions today in the city. Another thing we did is that we wanted to work on houses where people live, in fact. So we identified more than 12 houses that looked significant in the city. And we started restoring them to their original state, like doing investigations about the original colors, the original like state of like conservation. And we managed to restore a lot of them, and they became themselves like an attraction in the city. Now we're expanding on other sites surrounding the city. So like basically this was a royal guest house that was built in 1880 along the Nile, 10 kilometers to the north of the city. And now we're trying to restore it. But before restoring it, what we have been doing for a year is to engage the private sector and potential developers and developer operators and people from the community in the building itself before it's being restored, so we can develop together the programmatic use of the building before we even touch it. And this is actually working the other way around. People mostly like restore buildings and then think of like, let's say what we're going to do, use them for or whatever. But what we have learned is to engage like the private sector from a very early on to develop together with the government, with the private sector and the community, the most appropriate uses for like restoring such a building and how to bring it to the benefit of the local community over there. That takes us, speaking of like investors and economy, to another pillar of like our project, which is like development of small and micro enterprises within the city itself and how like they can benefit from the existing tourism industry. And to do that, we did like an extensive exercise to develop what we call the ISNA cultural tourism value chain, which is actually a value chain where is like in the different steps along the visitor experience where opportunities for improvement can happen, in fact, to improve the visitor experience, and how these opportunities to improve the visitor experience can benefit the local community. In other words, if you have efficiencies in terms of like the retail experiences or like food and beverage, transportation, accommodation, and whatever, what opportunities the community can benefit from. And by identifying these gaps, we've been able to develop a local economic development program that is intertwined with our physical interventions to make sure that whatever intervention physically we do has an economic impact on the community, a positive one. And it's related to a major industry. It's not just happening as is. So it's basically when we choose to restore a building or like, let's say a shop or whatever, our number one question is, would it really benefit the community or not in terms of like adding value to the visit, and it has a potential for sustainability or not. So we've been intervening in different facilities. For example, food and beverage. We went to existing like restaurants, instead of like redesigning the restaurants, we've been redesigning the menu to include like local foods and gastronomy from the region, actually, that is used, employing like local women, for example, over there. We have been working with very minimal interventions. So this is, for example, a complete refurbishment of a room in an existing hotel to turn it into something that's more related to the city and its culture, for example. And these were like very small investments. We're talking here about like 300 pounds, for example, per room, like sterling pounds, to upgrade an entire room or so. Working with local handicrafts, either existing ones like textile industry, for example, which is very local to the city, or developing new like designs and new products building on the city's heritage. So, for example, the city is very well known for wood products and wood crafts. So what we did is that we designed, let's say, a value chain or a supply chain of like producing high value wooden products that rely on the local heritage of the city by designing like high quality products and then training like women and girls on the production and actually how to promote these kind of like products. It's basically, this is one of the workshops we held at our office to design like products that rely on the local like heritage. So these are, for example, motifs that were taken from the Isna temple that are very unique to this temple and they don't exist anywhere. And basically we are taking these prototypes and we train like local women and girls on the production of these prototypes. So they are tested first, so they are like evaluated, and then they go into the production phase, and then we're gonna go to the marketing and selling phase. Another thing we did is that one of the major issues that were hindering tourism in Isna, that it had a very awful like retail experience. If you look at like guidebooks and so on, people were like really complaining about the quality of like the tourism experience and shopping experience in the Isna Bazaar and the shops. And we spent like a couple of years convincing local vendors first as to how they need to like focus on local products that are meaningful to the visitors. So like things of Upper Egypt that are unique and authentic. Second, they should be of high quality. Third, they should be of a fixed price, not to mention a price and then change it later on in a bargain. Treat the people well, no harassment of tourists and so on. And they should be like actually display a little number of like high quality products rather than just like filling the shop with anything. They didn't listen. None of them listened actually. And we're talking here about almost like 100 shops. So we decided to take a leap of faith. What we did is we invested our own personal money into building a concept store in the market that embodies all like what we're preaching, risking our own money and showing them it can work. And in fact, this shop, it sells like very high-end products coming from Cairo, very much more expensive than the ones they are selling, with fixed prices. And more importantly, the shop is run by a woman. It's the first woman actually running a shop in Isna out of like 100 shops on the bazaar. And the results were stunning. In 2 weeks, many of them started coming because they saw the model at work. They saw that we're not just like preaching about like what needs to be done, we're demonstrating it. So we're walking our talk and actually proving to them it can work. And eventually, they started flocking to the project, asking for help in branding and redesigning the shops, resourcing all of their stuff. And it was proved to be a very successful approach. So basically, we've been working with them on branding of the shops. So each shop now has a unique brand, a unique product that they are selling, and an identity. And these are like showing you before and after intervention in one of the shops. This is how they were selling their stuff, for example, for tourists. Mostly very low quality Chinese made products that you can see everywhere. So definitely no one would buy them. But what we did is that for this specific shop, for example, we shifted towards a completely different product, is handmade alabaster. So we changed the design of the shop, we changed the product, we changed the quality of the stuff they are selling. Now they have fixed prices, and the results were stunning. So like in 1 week, they sold the same number of sales of almost like a year. So it's basically, they started seeing the difference once they changed their attitude, the design, using creative designs and industries to show that it can result into economic results within the city itself. And it's a process of engagement with like the entire community. It's not only about the shop owners. So here we have a family, for example, of weavers who have worked together to refurbish their shop. And now it's one of the most successful shops in Esna, selling textiles. And now they're producing products of local like dresses and galabiyas, scarves of like very high quality. And they have shifted dramatically into like a more lucrative business that is more focused on the local identity. The third pillar that we're like, I would like to end up with is tourist promotion. And basically promotion is not only about putting an advert about the city out there. It starts before you come into the city, while you're there, and actually after you leave. All of this is related to promotion and the experience you're having. So one thing we did is to started to like develop like a visual identity of the city that is relying on the beautiful calligraphy of like on the woodwork we have in the city. And we used it to develop an entire like visual identity and branding identity for the city in terms of signage, like anything that is related to visual design in the city itself. It has the same, like, let's say, principles right now. And we developed a map. It's something that seems as very simple, but it's a breakthrough in the city, because if you can see to the top right, there are more than 30 sites listed right now in Isna. Before this map, there were only one, which is the temple located at the heart of this picture. And between Luxor and Esna, we identified more than 12 sites. So we have more than 40 sites that you can visit in the city right now that are mapped, and we have information about them. And we have almost like, let's say, guidebooks on the visitation of the city. One thing we wanted also to do is to piggyback on existing technologies rather than tending to produce our own websites and our own maps. So we used existing platforms like Google Maps, TripAdvisor, and this is a Google map like image of the city before we intervened on the map itself. And this is how it looks like after that. We inserted all the sites that we identified. We took high quality photography for them, and we put them all to promote them. So anybody coming with a mobile phone using TripAdvisor, using like Google Maps, they can identify the sites and visit them by themselves. Another thing we did is that we worked directly with the private sector because we wanted to follow a very pragmatic approach. Who decides who comes to Esna? And this was a question that we had since phase one. And we found that it's not the government, it's not the community, it's the tourist industry, especially abroad, not in Egypt. So we started working with the private sector into like developing not our own newsletters, but their own newsletters. So we worked with the private sector entities to enhance the newsletters they are sending to more than 25,000 like international tour operators about the city. And this worked like pretty much successfully because we used existing channels to like further promote the city itself. One of the things we identified while working with the private sector is the lack of like interpretation skills and know-how about the city among the tour guides and the people who are working within the industry itself. So we developed like accordingly a program which works almost on a quarterly basis where we train local tour guides from Cairo, from Luxor, and so on, and from Esna on the narrative and the interpretation skills about the city itself. Not only that, we created a body of local, let's say, volunteers who can guide you as local guides, mostly women from the city itself, who can guide you over there. And the results are like stunning. So if you see to the lower left here, the people standing in front of the Wakala are the patrons of the British Museum, who came specially to Esna to visit. On the upper photo, we have Azza Fahmy, one of like the very famous jewelry designers who work on an international level in Egypt. And it's basically, this is the kind of like visits we're getting right now because of the quality of the product that is being presented to them in terms of like experience. We used also other like very simple but very effective techniques. For example, photography exhibitions. This were like a very successful tool, not only to promote ESNA, but to convince the decision makers about the diverse cultural heritage of the city and its value. We used sketching, for example, and the first place where we exhibited all of that is in the local community itself. So the first exhibition we had was in the street in the city to the local residents, and we wanted to show them how like artists and like sketchers see their city in their eyes. And this was like an eye-opener for them to see like others, how they perceive the value of their city. And it was a very important event for us. Also, we work with schools. So far we like organized visits for almost like 3,000 kids to like different sites in ISNA. We are surprised that 70% of them haven't visited the temple before. 100% of them didn't visit any other attraction in the city. So it's basically creating this kind of local awareness about the value of heritage of the city and how it can become a major drive for local growth and economic development in the city. And the result is like now we're changing the type of visits that is coming to the city. We're changing the face of like the tours that are coming to the city, or people going around in the city itself, trying to interact with local residents, spend money, stay time there. And we can like measure these results right now, and we can see like significant impact of what has been done so far. And I would like to conclude with that. I leave it to you, Saif. So that's.
Thank you very much, Kareem. I think you've shown us a great example of how design can really transform a place, and also about how commitment and thoughtfulness and intelligence can have a huge impact. Like many of the other great architects that we've listened about or heard about today and on other days. I wanted to ask you actually, where do you think the place of contemporary design is in a city like Esna, which is so rich in heritage?
I think there is room for design, and I think the more difficult question, Saif, is for what purpose? Let's take, for example, the example of Muharraq, the city of Muharraq, okay, where like contemporary design played a very important role into promoting the city of Muharraq as a place that is actually can survive and actually offer a lot in terms of like experience to the visitors. And this was one of, I think, the smartest uses of contemporary design in a place like that. It has like a function, but we have to be aware of like what function it can play. Definitely a place like Isna is a place that is deteriorated. We're talking about an inner city that has been deteriorating for more than like 4 or 5 decades. And the way we can like use design into a larger scale of like, let's say, urban revitalization and how we can actually rebuild this fabric is so important. And it's a key decision about how the city is going to look like in the future. That's one of more on the urban scale and decisions that need to be taken about like how the city is going to look like in the future. But on a more like micro scale, what we saw in the intervention that we have done in the shops, for example, and the local markets, bringing in like quality designers to work with the residents, was more of like developing a way of communication between the designers and the vendors. So we're not talking about like very highly educated like shop owners. Some of them haven't even completed their education. But it's basically this kind of interaction where design can play a role into like giving an identity, a new identity to the place that can result into economic growth. And in fact, this played very well, even beyond our expectations. We didn't expect the results would be so quick and so impressive. So it's basically the cycle between the initial negotiations with the shop owner to the full completion is 4 weeks. So within 4 weeks, we conduct these kind of negotiations, resourcing the entire like type of like goods that are being sold. The designers work with the team over there to develop mood boards about the design and the intervention, and we implement them with contribution from the shop owners, and it's all 4 weeks. And the results, as I told you, were like very quick. We couldn't like, we were thinking that it's going to happen later on. So definitely there is room for design, but more importantly, where to use it and for what purpose is the more important question to me.
I think you've demonstrated well actually how design can be used very effectively to transform not only the perspective of outsiders, but also insiders. I mean, I think the example that you gave about the shop, of after trying to convince people, you did the shop yourself, and then you found people coming to you and asking you to help them do the same. It's a very good example of how actually design approaches to economic challenges can be really effective.
That's very true in two senses. One of them is the shop, after we opened it, it became a place for photo sessions. So people were not coming to the shop to shop, like, because it was expensive for like the local residents. It more was actually oriented to tourists, to show that there is a potential for tourists to invest more money into quality goods. So the place became a place for visitation and photo shoots and sessions. People were coming in the shops and taking photos for themselves over there. And second, design is what we have done in these shops that we didn't change much. If you look at the before and after photos carefully, you would find that we used every existing shelf, every existing, like, even opening in the wall, we used everything that was there, the existing tiling, everything. And this was a lesson to people, is that it doesn't mean to produce a quality design, it should be expensive. You can be creative about what you have and produce something that's important. They always, like, let's say the struggle that we're having with them, some of them would like to change the existing terrazzo tiles with marble, or like have an expensive, like, let's say, type of display or whatever. And we tell them, just keep it simple. You know, you just need a quality design that works with what you have. And this was an important, like, let's say, takeaway from that, because people think that visitors and guests would like to see like something that's fancy or expensive, but not necessarily quite of a good design. We said the investment should be in the good design, not only like a fancy material or whatever. We don't need it if you have a quality design and a good taste. And this is something that actually, another eye-opener to the community, is that they have a lot of resources that they can build on. They don't need to like use a tabula rasa approach where like erase everything and like start from anew. They just can build on what they have and come up with a good result.
Thanks. And there's a question about what hotels have been redesigned, or is it only, I mean, is Esna only accessible by boat tours, or is it also a place that you can stay?
This is a question from someone who would like to visit the city. So, okay, so this, okay, this is a visit planning question. Yeah, so basically Esna has like very limited hotels, actually two. One of them is very small, like it's basically you can rent like a bed, so it doesn't like really work for like visitors. It's mostly relies on villagers and locals. And the other one is a very limited hotel with 7 rooms, also relying on like people like working within the government, or like Egyptians coming from a governmental mission or whatever. So it doesn't really address the needs of tourists. So what we have been working with one of them, but also what we've been trying to do, because to use as a strategy, because we succeeded into, let's say, penetrating the retail like sector. So it's basically before we did our shop, we were not able to redesign a single shop. Now we're on the 8th shop. So we finished 8, we're targeting 30 more. So hopefully we'll end up with 40 shops. So another strategy that we're using right now is that we're working with local partners over there to turn some of the abandoned significant buildings into stays, like Airbnb or like booking.com or whatever. So in order to do that, we're investing in one house by our own like means to show them a model to like how it can work. And this is in a way a strategy for us to maintain some of the remaining significant buildings, other than people knocking them down or leaving them abandoned, is to reuse them, to reuse the city itself and its buildings. So it's basically, hopefully, like before the end of the year, we have like a couple of like Airbnb stays in Esna, which didn't exist before. We're working with the local hotel over there for stays. And in terms of visitation, 90% of the visits come like over a boat, but we're lucky because we're very close. We're almost like 1 hour away from Luxor. So far we're relying on, let's say, what they call like the overday visits, where people come from Luxor for a day and go back. But with availing stays over there, we aim to extend the length of stay in the city, and hence like more economic opportunities for us.
And the hotel room that you showed us that had been redesigned as an example, was that the one with 7 rooms, or was it which?
Yeah,
which
one of the 7 rooms, yes.
Okay. Well, thank you, Olivia, for preempting what I was going to say, which is please go ahead and ask questions and make comments. Kareem and I will be very happy to answer them. So anyone who has other questions, please type them in the chat box. But I mean, I think what you're saying, Kareem, is really interesting because it reminds me of your work in historic Cairo, where you worked on improving housing. And originally, it was hard to convince people that actually it was worth them investing in old houses in a poor part of Cairo, of historic Cairo. But once you worked on a pilot, every time you walked in the street, people would come up to you and say, when are you going to come and work on improving our house? And I think that approach of setting an example is a very important approach, which seems to work very well in ESNA as well. By changing, I mean, often it seems to me that by presenting people with an alternative that they might never have been able to imagine themselves.
Yeah, and that's very true. It's reading like a business book, and it was just like discussing the same approach of what we call the minimum viable product, is that you show people, it argues that people even don't know what they want. So it's basically at some points, and it sheds a lot of light on and questions about the value of participation at some point and how to use it. So it's basically, sometimes you have a concept that you want to validate, and not necessarily people share with you the same vision. You might be right, you might be wrong, but unless you go and implement it and people see it, you'll be just discussing in a vacuum. This happened to us with the government as well. So before we intervened, everybody wanted to knock down the city. They see no value of it. They saw only the temple that was important. But when we started restoring houses, showing them the potential, the whole vision started to change. Had you gone and asked the government and the local residents and everybody in the beginning what to do about it in a fully participatory process, the results would have been destructive. So it's basically, you need to engage with this kind of let's say, showing concrete examples, learning by doing, and building incrementally these solutions until you really perfect them, and you can show that they can really work. Others will come on board as well.
Thanks. There's a question also related to visiting about, apart from the trips from Luxor, how do you get the boats to stop? I mean, are they stopping more now that there's more to see?
Yes, that's correct. But it's the road to that was very complicated, because one of the things we've learned is to after the work in Aga Khan, after 20 years, to be more result oriented, not about restoring the city. The question for us was not to restore the city or to rehabilitate it, but to encourage economic growth within the city itself. So we had only one key question: who takes the decision for tourists to come down from the boat between Luxor and Aswan or not? Okay. So classically, it would be the community or the Ministry of Tourism, but that was not the case. It's the private sector that decides about that. And it's basically, this decision is taking a year ahead of time. So if you want people to stop in ESNA by 2024, end of 2024, you need to work from now on that, okay? So the result is, what we found is that when we started understanding an industry, we found there are two types of companies, what we call local operators, or in other words, what we call destination managers, which are the tourist companies in the country. And there are international tour operators, the ones who are, if you're walking through the streets in London and you see an advert about a visit to Egypt and a program that appeals to you, these are the ones selling you the program to come to Egypt. So basically, you need to convince them. You need to work with them and show the potential of the city. So when they become convinced and start promoting the different dimensions of the benefits of visiting the city, it becomes part of the program. Hence, the boat stops and the tourists come down. So time is made along the program for them to visit. So what we have been doing is that we have been working with key decision makers within the industry itself, doing things called fan visits, the familiarization visits, because despite the fact they have been around in the industry for 30 years, they know nothing about the city. They just hear about it or have visited it 15 years ago, but they never know what's happening about it. So one of the things, almost on every 2 months, we have an important fan visits for private sector, investors and private sector, companies, to come and experience the entire tour and eat from local food, visit people in their homes and so on, and visit the shops. So, and then we provide them with the different, let's say, material that they can use to promote the city among the tour operators. So we're more focusing on a business to business model than a business to client. Another thing, for example, we have worked with the Lonely Planet to develop the new section in ISNA on like the edition that is going to come up next year on Egypt. So basically, we're trying to like think smart about the decision makers and the ones who are taking the decisions. It's very difficult to influence the decision of a tourist once they are signed in for like a program. You need to change the program itself, and then you can like develop everything around it.
Thanks. There's another question about who are the stakeholders in low quality, high volume tourism, and what is their response to your initiatives?
They are the ones we just talked about. So it's basically, it's, yeah. Since 1997, Egypt has been shifting towards a model of, we call it the all-inclusive model. So you can like, I saw this myself in Germany like a few years ago. You can come to Egypt. This is including like a round trip flight, stay for a week, all like inclusive, like 3 or 4 meals, visit different sites, and you pay almost like 500 euros. This is very cheap, okay? So, and it's basically, it has to do with the, let's say, the macro economy of like tourism in Egypt. And this is something we're trying at least to shift in our like work, is that it's basically, we're working with them on trying to make the boat stop, but that's not our like primary strategy. Our primary strategy is focusing on more affluent type of tourists that comes, and luckily docks in ISNA, but they never visited. They dock in ISNA, they call the Habayas, which are like smaller boats, more fancy, like let's say excursions with limited number of people. And it's almost like very exclusive travels. So it's basically, this is the kind of like visits we're trying to target. Second, we're trying to target what we call like on-land visits, people who are like either staying on Luxor or visiting Luxor. So we're not focusing on volumes of tourists. What we're focusing on is the level of expenditure and the time quality time they are spending. So we want to make sure that they have a quality experience and that they spend money in the city, not by like forcing them to spend the money, but like luring them into spending into high quality products in terms of like food and beverage, handicrafts, and so on, experiences. So this is the kind of work we're trying to do. So low quality, high volume tourism is not our aim, because they are like, it's a very, let's say, consumer, like, let's say, type of tourism that actually hurts you more than brings benefits. So that's how we're trying to avoid it in our project.
Thanks. There's a comment which also ends in a question. Thank you so much, Kareem, for such an informative, inspiring chat. I really enjoyed hearing about the participatory process of the local inhabitants and your examples of the alabaster and textile shops. Are there any other special success stories that you can share with us that improve the quality of life for the locals?
We have dozens of them. You can visit our like Facebook page. Like,
okay, choose one.
Okay, let's talk about like thing that's important, because very often projects focusing on the outcome to the community, but we focus on the process as important like to us. So one of the things we've done is that I can mention 3 like dimensions. One is that the techniques and the processes we used are very labor intensive, and we mean that we design processes that can use labor as much more than materials. So we have a 57%, let's say, component of labor. Usually in such projects, it's 15 to 20%. So most of our money goes to local labor. And it's basically in the first phase of the project, we managed to create 31,000 man days of work within the first phase, only in 2 years of like work. And this like really was appreciated by the community. One example of this as well, or like the second example, is an engineer that worked with us from ISNA. And the guy was like a civil engineer, had nothing to know about like conservation or historic buildings and stuff like that. He was completely trained within the project. And later on, he like got a job in a very reputable like conservation company in Egypt. So we worked in one of the most important buildings in the country, in Cairo. Now he's heading their team in Saudi Arabia, and he's like personally, like, let's say, promoted pretty much, and he has learned everything about conservation in this project. Third, there is an environmental dimension as well of our project. So it's basically most of our materials are recycled. What I didn't mention is that we almost recycled 500,000 bricks in the first phase of the project from mud bricks. So we didn't buy materials. We recycled most of them, wood, bricks, and whatever, to reduce the environmental footprint of the project and to show that if you want to talk about climate change, okay, it's fine to separate garbage and all, like use like a light-saving lamp and stuff like that, but you can recycle entire cities. Urban conservation is about, and rehabilitation is about not like recycling a building or a product. You can recycle entire cities. And you can do it with a way that can bring in economic benefits to everyone. There are many other stories of increased like revenues for like local residents, women who manage to like be trained on like handicrafts and become their own like entrepreneurs. There are many stories about that. So we're very proud of our local core of local guides who are now working with the private sector. So we have women that have been trained to become local guides, and now they work on their own as guides for tourist companies coming to the city. So dozens of stories. So these are some of them.
Thank you for sharing them.
Thank you.
Kareem, I don't know if you can see Hafiza's comment, but she says she loves hearing about these uplifting endeavors, thoughtful, conscious, and impactful. Yeah, the only thing that doesn't come across in the way, because Kareem is so successful in his project, is actually that everything is challenging and takes persistence and time and patience and forcefulness and a combination of many, many skills, I would say.
Thank you. And thank you, Hafiza, for like your nice words.
Okay, well, if there are no other questions, I think it's...
Yeah, I would like to add something, Saif. Yeah, when we're talking about like quality design and architecture and so on, one of the key takeaways from what we have like been through over the past 6 or 7 years is the concept of value, okay? And it's basically, we're not talking about quality design on its own. We're talking about value. What value your work can bring to the different stakeholders and to yourself. And this is a very important tool to measure whether you're doing like a socially responsible architecture or not. You can win awards and you can like do whatever, but in the end, you need to be able to measure like the value of your work to others. And if you're bringing value to others in terms of like improvement to quality of life, improvement of revenues, improvements of so on and so forth, you're on the right path. And you need to keep this perspective in mind when you're working. Is socially responsible architecture in itself is a tool, okay? It's not the end goal. The end goal is improving quality of life. And you need to make sure that it really brings value to these like stakeholders.
Thanks. And I think that your project is a very good example of the whole approach that has added a huge amount of value to a place.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, everyone. And next week is our last session. Looking forward towards the future in architecture and urbanism. And I hope you'll join us. And thanks for listening. And I hope you found this project as inspiring as I have, and I think it's a good example of how architecture is much more than just doors and windows and floors and roofs. So thank you once again, Kareem.
Thank you, Saif, and thank you, Patrick, and have a nice day. Hope you.